Everybody for coming. We could do like a roundtable, get to know each other, but I know you want to get going with the ballot props. So I won't spend too much time doing introductions, but thank you for that nice introduction. I do teach political science at the University of Redlands, and I have spent a lot of the better part of the last week trying to sort through some of these very important big issues that are on the ballot as initiatives, and I'm here to share with you some pros and cons about each one of them. I am not here, so a few disclaimers. I'm not here to convince you to vote for them one way or the other. I do have opinions. I cannot completely unbias myself, right? My biases will undoubtedly come through in the way I talk about them, in the way that my facial expressions end up sort of looking. So you'll get a sense of how I, how I think that maybe they should go. But I'm not here to convince you to vote for them one way or the other, right? That's not my job. My job really today, I think, is just to give you a good sense of how these ballots propositions are set up, what they would do possibly, and then take a look at some of the endorsers. I haven't done that for every single one of them, but you'll get a good sense at least of what these are like. Okay, and you should feel free to ask questions. And I know that I believe that Monse has some ability, and the moderators have some ability to do that. Or you can, I don't know, how do you want to deal with questions?
Y'all can just add your name in the chat and then we'll call on you and you could ask your question.
All right. Yeah.
Renee's going over a certain topic, then we'll wait when she's done talking about that topic and we'll call on you.
All right, cool. There are 12 ballot propositions that you all are going to get familiar with. And I don't have all the answers. I've tried to be fairly thorough, but there's still more that I could have done to really get up to speed on these. But I will share with you where I am with these ballot propositions. So without further delay, if I can make this work, hang on. There we go. First of all, I do start off each one with a haiku. Thanks to Jamie and Carol for that. There are the ballot haikus that help you kind of like get a sense of what they're all about. I consulted Cal Matters, Sacramento Bee, the LA Times, a bunch of other newspapers, KQED, California Secretary of State's official ballot, and then I went to a lot of the pro and con sites to try to figure out what's going on. So those are just some of the ones that I looked at. Now, look, if you want to know who the big spenders are, there's a law in California that says you can go to Cal Access and you can see who's spending and who's spending how much on all of these initiatives. For the record, there is no limit on the amount of money that a donor can give to a ballot measure campaign. So you're going to see some really big amounts here, like the California Association of Realtors spending $41 million to try to get that one passed. Uber has spent $51 million. And this is actually as of a few days ago. So it's not even, I mean, they in the last couple of weeks, they're going to be pushing more money into the system. But you can, in fact, get a sense of where the money's coming from. And the green would be for, the red would be no, like against. Okay. No significant spending on 17 and 18. All right. Prop 14. All right. So let's start. Here we go. This is a bond measure. It is a $5.5 billion bond measure. And here's the haiku. 5.5 billion backs stem cell research and boosts access to treatments. Okay. That is about equal to about $5 per person per year. Now, what's a bond? Just so you know, that's when the state of California has to borrow money and we, the taxpayers, pay it back with interest. Now, paying back a $5.5 billion bond almost doubles the face value of it. So it's really like a $10 billion bond after you pay it back. Now, I have done this, so I'm not going to go through like, one by one pops up. Everything's just here. So if you want to come back to this and kind of glance at it, if somebody else wants to watch this on a rerun, they can just see everything at once. It is a little bit of, it's a lot for the eyes to take in though. Let's go through the pros first. All right. It would spur medical research and discoveries. And this started with a $3 billion bond that Californians passed quite a few years back when the federal government looked like they were going to stop stem cell funding. So this should be, I should have put that in another slide, but this basically continues the work that was started with that $3 billion seed money. Over 2,900 discoveries have happened and counting. And the hope here is that it actually lowers the healthcare costs over time if you find cures, right? If you can find ways to manage really terrible illnesses. and disorders that people are born with typically. That they can also be things like Alzheimer's, right? It interrupts ongoing research if we don't pass it, right? So if we don't pass this money, a lot of that research that is not funded by other foundations or the federal government might be interrupted or go away. Federal money does exist, but more research is better. And having the state of California helping to kind of fill gaps is always great for research. So it does provide a kind of economic stimulus, a very small one, albeit it's small. And the state does get royalties from some of the discoveries, although it's somewhere to the tune of like $500,000 a year. It's not that much, unless of course somebody came up with some amazing new true, like breakthrough, and then the state would really benefit. It also delays the repayment of those bonds by 5 years. Now on the con side, this is state-sponsored research, but do we really want that? Is this really the role for government? Should the state be setting science budgets this way? Like, this is the state of California actually prompting research. And of course, the original impetus or the original reason for having this doesn't really exist anymore, because the federal government says it's fine, we can have federal stem cell funding. And so that is available to researchers today. And we're talking about researchers everywhere, at Stanford, at UCLA, in other kinds of clinics and, foundations and so, or, foundations and so forth. They complain that there have been no life-saving breakthroughs in the first round. I mean, there are about 40 or 50 people who would beg to differ, but because they actually did find some really important cures for some very obscure diseases. And I can tell you that finding cures for obscure diseases is not something that big pharma or big research really likes to have to pony money up for. The money can, in fact, be spent on funding research buildings. It's not just restricted to the researchers itself and paying salaries and things like that. The argument here is state can't afford it. Why are we spending money on this? And private funding, as well as state, as well as federal funding, is available for this kind of research. So that's the basic pros and cons. All right. As far as endorsements, a whole lot of Nobel Prize winners say we need this. The University of California has endorsed it. Of course, that's where a lot of really important research happens. And about 200 health-related nonprofits. So if you or someone you love is afflicted by epilepsy or leukemia or lymphoma or ALS, there's all kinds, 200 different disorders, right? Those organizations typically are supporting this because they want to see the research continue. And in their view, more research is better. On the no side, most of the state's largest newspaper editorial boards have actually said, vote no, this is not for the state to do. San Francisco Chronicle, LA Times, OC Register. So it's kind of all across the board. All right, so that is basically Prop 14. And again, I'm not telling you yes or no here. Okay. All right, Proposition 15. I have to put on my haiku voice. Hikes property tax on large commercial buildings, funds counties and schools. Okay, trying to get my thing to go here. Okay, so you're going to see when it has a beige background, this is just like the basic facts. So you have to know something about Prop 13 first. And some of you do know about Prop 13, but I'm going to tell you a little more. So in 1978, we had a tax revolution in California. Our property taxes were going through the roof, and the Howard Jarvis and Paul Gann citizens got together and said, we need to stop the tax increases. The state is a surplus. They're not giving our money back to us. Our property taxes, which are based on market values of a house, are going up and up and up every year, and grandma and grandpa are getting kicked out of their houses. That was the basic argument. Not just grandma and grandpa, but you and me could happen to us, but especially those people on fixed incomes. So in 1978, Prop 13 hits the ballot, and it caps. And of course, people are like, yes, we want to cap our property taxes, because if I paid at that time, let's say $50,000 for a house, and it's actually worth $60,000 next year, why would I want to have to pay it on $60,000 next year? And what if it's worth $70,000 next year, or it's worth $75,000, right? So it's a lot of uncertainty. So Prop 13 comes in, and we the people basically said, you have to cap the property tax to 1% of the sales price. So if you pay $100,000 for a house it's $1,000. Boom, that's your property tax, $1,000. Now add to that a few other things like it can go up 2% a year. So then, I mean, it's not going to be very much over time. But what will happen is that you will get other kinds of local bonds and other parcel taxes that are loaded onto it. And so the average homeowner pays more like 1.1% a year of this original sale price of whatever you paid for your home. Now, Prop 13 covers everything. Like, it doesn't cover just homeowners, it covers commercial properties as well. This is what we call, and I should actually put it in, the split roll. SPLIT-ROLL, split roll. Split roll means we're splitting homeowners from commercial properties. This is the very first time it has hit the ballot. And so this Prop 15 would carve out all commercial properties that are worth $3 million or more and make them pay market rates. So they would be reassessed every 3 years. Every 3 years, they would be reassessed. And they'd say, okay, well, this year, the property that you are on, it's actually worth, it's not just $10 million business, it's actually worth about $11.5 million. So you're going to pay on $11.5 million, okay? This would generate billions in property taxes up and down the state, millions at the local level for local government, most of which goes to fund things like hiring your firefighters and paying for your local police and your local roads. I mean, everything that your local government provides, which are essential services, and your schools. And schools have been chronically underfunded since 1978 because of this. And we've come up with all kinds of tax schemes to try to figure out how to recoup that money. So it would generate the billions for into local property taxes that would be used in local governments and schools if these properties were assessed at market rates, what the property would sell for in that year. It does not touch regular homes. Does not touch regular homes. I think that's worth pointing out because it splits the roll. There is really no danger that this is going to come to you and it's going to be your house next. The people of California, trust me, would never vote for that. I don't know what, in what reality, even with the, the crazy way that we set up taxes, no homeowner is going to vote to raise their property taxes. That would be like suicide. So no, it's not going to happen. So don't pay attention to any giant, or sort of arguments that are saying like, oh, homes are next. That's just not happening. Okay. The other thing that this does is that it creates a new property exemption for small businesses. So if prices, let's say the rent goes up, small businesses can now claim $500,000 real property exemption. Like they can exempt this in their property, or not property tax, but on their business taxes, so that they're paying less taxes overall, and it could create credit for them actually in the first couple of years. Okay. So here are the basic pro and cons, which I've kind of already gone over, but the pro arguments, like if you want to vote for Prop 15. We have totally unequal tax bills across California, and companies are not like people who die. Corporations reap wealth in perpetuity. You could create all kinds of, shell companies. That's probably not the right way to put it, but you can create there are ways of creating companies as a corporation, right, that keep going and going, and you can just pass that benefit along. So the fact is that, and Disneyland comes to mind partly because a lot of us have been there and we can see how big that property is, right? But Disneyland has been around since the 60s, and 50s or 60s? I can't remember what year it opened, I think in the 60s. But imagine if Disneyland were paying, so Disneyland has that land, right? Imagine if Disneyland had to pay market rates on their property holdings right now. Okay, they're going to be paying a lot more, tens of millions of dollars, probably more, because the value of the land that Disneyland sits on is protected by Prop 13. But if Prop 15 comes along, then it's going to come in and say, hey, Disneyland, you now have to pay based on all of your holdings based on market rates. Well, places like Disney are not liking this kind of thing, right? Now, The education, another argument for is that the education system serves the most diverse in the entire country. We have a 6 million strong school population and has been scrounging for money since 1978. And overall, depends really on what you consider to be part of the per pupil spending. You know, for the first time, we're like, in the last few years, we've been above average. We already spend 40% of our state budget on schools, but we're taken from all over the place. It comes from our general fund. It comes from state property taxes. But the fact is that, schools really have a long way to go if they want to be in even the top, 10%, 20% of schools, per pupil spending. Okay, there are actually a few more, but let's go to the con arguments. Against this, well, California's hostile business environment is driving out jobs and companies, and this just adds to the mess. So higher taxes are going to be passed on to small businesses that are, let's say, if you're in a high-rise building, and that high-rise building is now, going to be reassessed. Well, every single company inside that building is now going to be charged more because who else is going to pay for the property taxes? It's either coming out of the profits, but a lot of big companies don't like to lose profits, so they just pass those costs along to the businesses who rent from them, or to the businesses who are doing, or to their customers, the consumers. And that, of course, will contribute to higher costs of living and higher costs of doing business for everyone. So that's some of the pro cons. Let's keep going. The pro arguments, well, there are $500,000 in new exemptions on real property to help small businesses. So small businesses really probably won't be the ones who are hurting the most, but they are going to weather some higher market prices for their rents. And there is a delay. I think it's like 3-year delay so that they can renegotiate leases and so forth. It doesn't go into effect tomorrow. It's not going to go into effect in January 1st, right? It doesn't go into effect for a few years. So that, I think it's 2023. So then in fact, you can they have some time to adjust. But it's not entirely clear what the market is going to do to those rates, right? It is fairer in the sense that it evens the playing field for all businesses. And those who put this together will tell you that Prop 13 was never intended to kick, grandma and grandma. It was intended to help grandma and grandpa, but not like the grandma grandpa business, right? It's like, well, wait a minute, commercial properties were never supposed to be part of this. But the way that the law was written, it included them. So I believe it's about 80 mega companies that, now there's a lot of companies, but we're talking about like mega companies. And I don't quote me on the 80, but we're talking about, there's a handful of really important big giant companies like ExxonMobil or Chevron that own coastal properties, and Disneyland, and that they've owned property for time immemorial. And so they've owned this property for a really long time, and they're extracting oil and they're extracting things out of the ground. And they have these very profitable businesses, but they're paying really low taxes. Okay, so the pro people say that's not fair. You have to even the playing field because all those big, giant, old companies have a really big advantage over newer companies and newer, smaller businesses that have smaller footprints. And again, if you only have a footprint of $3 million, you're exempt from the law. It's any property that's over $3 million. Of course, in California, a lot is worth over $3 million. But anyway, all right, con arguments. These, if you look at what Prop 13 did, it really did increase the fees for a lot of companies in a lot of different ways. So local governments went scrounging around and trying to raise fees to make up for a lot of the lost revenue from Prop 13. So a lot of those, the gaps have been closed by tacking on all kinds of other fees. So what about those? Okay, well, so it just, in other words, it's increasing the cost of doing business in California. And of course, it was going to mean passing on higher taxes through higher rents and to customers. And they're saying, well, market forces are going to drive out big businesses. Maybe not Disneyland, or will Disneyland say, you know what, the cost of this is just so astronomically high. you know, for the amount of taxes we're going to pay over the next 5 years, we could save all that money, go build a new one in Nevada. You know, like we don't know exactly what the future will hold. So again, here, Prop 13 was never supposed to protect the businesses that don't die. And it's fair because it evens the playing field. And especially for mega companies that sit atop these old property taxes. And they've been able to really increase their wealth at astronomical rates. But again, will they flee the state? And honestly, the state of California really does rely a lot on very wealthy individuals and wealthy corporations that actually do provide profits. We have a kind of a screwed up tax system to begin with. Okay, before I get to Prop 16, are there any questions about Prop 15? Monse, anybody? Oh, I just want to give you a chance to ask.
So I'm not sure if you went over this, but do you have any references over who like supports Prop 15 or who's against it?
Yeah, I don't actually have I don't have the endorsers and the for this one. I tried to get everything done, but I just couldn't get there. If you just type in yes on 15 and no on 15, they'll come up. But essentially, like the California Teachers Association and the California Federation of Teachers, like teachers associations are really for this because they're like, this is going to be a windfall for schools. I mean, schools will get billions more. And, you know, you can hire more teachers and you can expand you can do all kinds of things. I mean, imagine if the schools had billions more to spend, right? It would really change the way that we do or could change a lot of our public schools in California. Who's against it? Virtually every business, right? I mean, you know, the Chamber of Commerce and pretty much all business interests because look, you know, they're economic generators and this would mean higher taxes pretty much for everybody because California is already known as having a very anti-business environment. So this would just, you know, push us further down that road and create more uncertainty. And so, you know, because of the okay, so now you know that these businesses are going to be reassessed every 3 years. Commercial properties, that is. It's like, it just makes the cost of doing business more. Other questions? Nada? You want to give me the high sign? We keep moving? Yep. Okay. All right. So Proposition 16, haiku voice, repeals a ban on affirmative action for jobs, schools, and contracts. Okay. So Prop 16 is about diversity as a factor in government, that is public education, public employment, and public contracting. So this goes back to Proposition 209. It would repeal Proposition 209, which prohibited these factors from being considered in government hiring and school admittance, that is for UC and Cal States, since 1996, and also contracting. Our government, that is the Democratic-run legislature, referred the measure. Shirley Weber, who is Dr. Shirley Weber, who's an assemblywoman here in San Diego, has gotten behind this measure. It would permit consideration of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or natural origin in public education. So like not Redlands because we're not public employment, and public contracting to address diversity factors. It does not alter other state or federal laws guaranteeing equal protection and prohibiting unlawful discrimination. That's an important feature because it does leave certain exceptions in place. It doesn't completely go to a system where now it's just like, oh, hey, it's like, it's all about your race and I'm hiring you because you are skin color or you're not skin color. It's not that, right? Because that would be illegal because of the ways the United States Supreme Court has ruled about how the 14th Amendment must be applied, federal laws, as well as state laws. So there are a lot of protections. This one carves out exceptions. And but it does also leave other exceptions in place, like considering the sex of an employee when you are in state prison. So, you know, if you have like a female prison population, you have to consider the sex or gender of an employee in that situation. or awarding contracts to minority-owned businesses receiving federal funding. There are protections for that too already. So some of the pro and the cons. By the way, I want to say, I don't know if I can see everybody across the top. Is it covering up anything for you guys, like the words? No? Okay. I just want to make sure. All right. On the pro side, if you're going to vote yes on this measure, you are considering the fact that we have not fixed the problems that we have in our state regarding race and ethnicity when it comes to government and hiring and contracting. In other words, well, we just got through a whole summer of upheaval and we're still there, right? And so if we want to address some problems that we have socially and politically, well then, and economically, this is a way to address it. Most contracts in government still go to white male-owned businesses. This would, in fact, allow government to say, okay, I want to forefront this person, right? In other words, I want, let's say, African-American women-owned businesses to profit or benefit from this. Thank you. My dinner just arrived. To benefit from those kinds. Yeah, sure. To benefit from these kinds of contracts. Okay. It does affect some areas where race and ethnicity or gender should be considered. For example, like, okay, so here's the example. If you are at UCLA and you're hiring for a race and ethnic politics position, under current law, you may not consider the ethnicity or race or race or ethnicity or gender of that person you're trying to hire to teach race and ethnic politics. And here's the question: should you or shouldn't you? We have a very diverse population of students, and so if you are a diverse, if you're a person of color and all you see is white professors, well, that affects the way in which you may experience education. And so at UCLA, if you're not allowed, or any of the UCs or any of the state schools, if you're not allowed to consider race and ethnicity, what kind of a system are we recreating, right? Because yes, we do have more persons of color who are coming up through the ranks, but it's a slow process. So this is something to consider. And so again, the state is just kind of replicating systemic biases by not considering these factors. This is the pro side. Now, if you are against it, it's a pretty simple argument against it. Being race blind or race to sex and gender, or ethnicity or whatever, all these factors is fairness. And it means we are treating everyone equally. And so, for example, in the example I gave at UCLA, why should you hire somebody considering anything about them except for what they know and how they would teach it? And it doesn't matter what they look like. It doesn't matter what their skin color is. What matters is that they can teach what they are being hired to teach. And in if you're against it, you also would argue that affirmative action isn't fair. It's never fair because it creates a kind of unequal playing field, elevating it for some people based on factors that they cannot control, like their skin color, and it creates reverse discrimination against people who would be just as qualified for these positions, or in the case of UC admissions, would create a situation where certain kinds of students aren't admitted just because of the color of their skin. And that's what 209 was addressing. So this is the question, pro or con? Oh, whoa. Okay, so are there questions about that? So that, it's a pretty straightforward con against, pretty straightforward pro. It actually is not going to change the entire law. Now, I will say, I am not a constitutional lawyer. I don't know exactly how all of these laws would align and what would be allowed and what wouldn't, but I do believe, as I've read it and the way that the legislative analyst has explained it, that in fact it would just allow these factors to be one of many to be considered. And it would allow them to be considered instead of not considered, right? So that's kind of the big difference with this one. Are there other questions? Are there any questions about this one? Wave. No. Okay. All right. So break in, let me know if you have any questions. This does take a while. So if you all want to like pop in, pop out, I don't mind at all. This is going to be a while. We're only on the second. There we go. We're on finally on 17. Okay. Allows parolees to register to vote and to run for office. So under current law, after serving their prison time, parolees regain, or sorry, let me back up a little bit. Under current law, parolees who are in state prison cannot vote. Okay, so what this would do is that after serving their prison time, that is the time literally when they're locked up, and then put on parole, and parole is usually about 3 years, they would regain certain citizenship privileges like voting. All right, so they're out of jail, they're on parole, it would allow them to vote, and technically would allow them to run for office, but I don't know of any parolees or recent felons who have like been skyrocketing through the ranks and becoming governor of California. It's pretty unlikely. Okay, but even at the local level, and I mean, to get an elected office, that's a pretty big strike against you. So I stick that in there. Yeah, technically you can run for office, but it doesn't mean that all of a sudden it's going to change things. Now, parole is part of a sentence, and usually 3 years. It represents a transition back to civil society. Note that we have two kind of levels: jails, county jails, where we put people for lower level crimes, and then we have prisons, state-run prisons, like all the way up to death penalty case, capital crime, death row inmates, who, by the way, are all at this very moment have been reprieved, or at least those have all been put on hold because Governor Newsom has put a moratorium on the death penalty. In any case, if you are in state prison, if you are going to be let out, right, you could be paroled. All right. Now, those in county jail then already have voting privileges. There are actual polls in county jails, but this would apply to about 50,000 people who have served their sentences already, and now they're serving. They're on parole. All right, so Prop 17, if you're for this amendment, or sorry, for this initiative, you're saying that, well, their prison time has been served, people should return to society. Oh my gosh, I just realized I didn't finish it. I'm gonna have to talk you through this. Okay, so after prison time has been served, people should return to society. And for some reason, I know I did this at one point and it disappeared and I meant to come back to it, so I'm sorry about that. On the con side, and honestly, what I should do, since people are actually doing this, I should end it. I'm just gonna add it on here. Con side is that parole means you're still a prisoner, right? Still in the system and not free. Okay. And I'm typing with a broken wrist, so isn't that lovely? Okay. So you're not free, so why should you get a free pass? You're not a regular citizen yet. And so this is really about how do we want to treat, depending on how you want to vote on this, this really does come down to, well, how do you feel about parolees? Do you feel like, okay, we need to provide a bridge for them and then allow about 50,000 people the choice of voting? Or do you just say, you know what, you can regain full citizenship when you're no longer on parole? Okay, that's basically what this comes down to. Okay, other questions? Nope. Okay, Proposition 18 lets young folk who turn 18 by November vote in the primary. I should play music in the background every time I do that. Okay, you have to be 17 to vote in the primary. Or if you're 17, you could vote in a primary is the basics here. Okay, so if you're for this, it would mean that you could train people up in civic engagement and create good habits in a group that doesn't vote very much, right? 17-year-olds and 18-year-olds just really don't vote very much. And they would say, well, what do you mean they're not mature enough at 17? Well, only a portion are going to be like 6 to 8 months out from the general election. Most people are pretty close to the general election. At most you're going to be that far out. We have our primary in March or in June of every 2 years. So this would allow 17-year-olds, if they're going to be 18 at the time of the general election, they're not still 17, but if they have already turned 18 by the general election and they can vote in the general election in November, it gives them a chance to make impactful decisions in the primary. On the con side, it's pretty straightforward again. They're not mature enough. And even at 8 months out before they turn 18, they're still immature. And in California, because we vote on tax measures, well, they don't pay taxes, so they would get to vote on bonds in the primary, in primaries, and they're not mature enough. And those are the rules, and you have to be 18, period. End of story. Okay, the only thing I'm going to add to this is that in California, we do have bonds that are put on the ballot by the legislature, and we can only vote on legislatively referred measures in the primaries. So in the primaries, when you're voting on all those initiatives, there are only going to be a handful of them, like there were in March. There were only a handful of them. Why? Because you can only get them on there through the legislature. Anything the people want to put on the ballot must be in the general election. So it has to be saved for November. So if we're talking about doing things like changing up, like Prop 15 is doing, it would have a big impact on taxes. You have to be 18 to vote on that. But I mean, let's be realistic. How much maturing are you doing? Let's say your birthday is, in March, let's say your birthday is in October this year, and you're still 17 back in March. I mean, are you really going to be that much more mature? And so the maturity thing is really an issue. I'm not really buying the maturity issue argument, but the con side is these are the rules, you're 18, boom. And on the pro side, it's like, well, you're going to be 18. Let's try to make you more civically engaged. All right. Questions? No questions. Okay. All right. Moving on. Proposition 19. Seniors moving to a more expensive home would save property tax. Okay. So property taxes, as you have already heard through Prop 13, are limited for certain groups of people, especially those who bought, and I'll go back here, especially those who bought or have owned a home in 1978 or before. If you owned a home in 1978 and you still live in it, and there are people who still have their homes, you still pay based on 1978, whatever you paid in 1978 or before, okay? And in fact, I know people who still do. My own father does, right? He still pays 1978 property taxes because he built his house in 72 or 73. Okay, so he still pays under Prop 13. But guess what? If and when, he's 81, someday he will pass away. If he still has his house and I inherit it, I get the property tax benefit. And so would you. You would get your parents' property tax benefit, not just based on 1978, but whatever your parents paid for their house, and however long they've been in it, that property tax benefit passes on to you. That's called the inherited tax, right? That's an inherited benefit. So that can happen once. You can either pass it down to grandchildren, skipping over one generation, or you can pass it on to kids, and they inherit the Prop 13 protection. Okay, that's number one. Now, number two, there are other kinds of benefits that we have added on to Prop 13 over the years, including if you're 55 years old and you move, you can keep your property tax exemption when you move to a new house one time. You already get that privilege. If you are severely disabled, you get that privilege too. If you've got a Prop 13 exemption, you can take it with you. It's portable. Okay. And even for disaster, people who have been affected by disasters too. Okay. Now, this is the second attempt by realtors in California to place this on the ballot. We saw it just a couple of years ago, and so it repeats a 2018 initiative. But the legislature actually did put it on the ballot. They were convinced. It allows homeowners age 55 plus to keep the lower property tax, the Prop 13 rate, if they're moving to a new home. Now, it says the same size or smaller, but in fact, I I did some more reading up on it. I'm gonna stop my two. I'm just gonna say new home because I don't know if it's the same size or smaller. So I need to double check that one. You can see I'm like, I'm trying to be perfect about this, but I'm not. I read somewhere else that it was actually moving to a new home, even if it's bigger. So I need to double check. But they can do it up to 3 times. So they can move 3 times and still have that property tax exemption. So in other words, if you're over 55, whoop-de-doo, you basically pay low property taxes, period, right? I mean, that's relative because you might have been living in a really big house, but you can keep the, the benefit. But most people over 55, the disabled and disaster ravaged homeowners already are covered, as I mentioned. Now, some of you have seen The Big Lebowski, okay? The Big Lebowski, the man, Jeff Bridges. He's been held up as a poster child for why the current exemptions for inheritance can be exploited. So kids can inherit this property tax, as I explained, one-time transfer. And this requires, and so let me just explain that. So Jeff Bridges grew up in Malibu. His parents bought a house in Malibu in the 1950s, and he inherited the house when they died. And now he can rent out his parents' house for $15,000 a month. And he's only paying, basic property taxes based on the value of the home or the sale price in 1950, because it's a property tax, it's covered by the property tax. 13. It's covered by Prop 13. Okay. Well, we can all look at some people like Jeff Bridges and go, well, naughty. Like that's like exploiting a loophole. Well, there aren't that many people in California who are doing that. But this would change it so that anybody trying to do it would require them to make it their primary residence. And in a year, if it's not your primary residence, if that's not your actual home, and you just happen to own it, and you're rich enough to keep it and rent it out, then you actually have to get it reassessed at market value in a year. So after a year, after you inherit that house, if you're not living in it as your full-time residence or primary residence, which usually means more than 6 months, then you have to get it reassessed. And now you're going to be paying market rate values or property tax based on the market rate. Okay. So that is a different, that would change like what kinds of properties are for sale. And maybe Jeff Bridges would then decide to move, like to pay, maybe he'll just pay more property taxes because he wants to hold on to his childhood home. Who knows? All right. But it does allow people, one other big change, it allows people to take that benefit anywhere in the states. Now, within California, it's now limited to if you buy a house within the county that you currently live in. Why? Because the property taxes that you pay are based on counties, right? And the county tax assessor collects your money. You pay your bill to the county tax assessor. And so that system has grown up, right? We have a local government system that collects these taxes. And so it will, we're gonna have to change that system somehow to figure out how much people pay if this passes. It generates higher property taxes for non-primary residential homes to pay for the 55 plus special benefits. So the idea here is that, okay, well, if we carve out this big, like basically if you just allow people 55 or older to never pay market rates, and they're always paying on Prop 13 rates, well, you're actually creating a whole bunch of people who are lowering the amount of money that is going to be paid overall. But if we charge the inheritors market rates, then their property taxes will go up, and somehow this will all balance out in the end. So that's kind of how this is situated. All right, so Prop 19, if you're for it, it's like the realtors are excited about it because they believe that it's going to lead to the exchange or the selling of a lot of properties. They argue that baby boomers are going to move into smaller homes, and it's going to help them because if they're moving into a smaller home that actually costs more than the house they're living in, then they can take that Prop 13 protection and move it into a smaller home. And then they open up their nice home that can be turned over to a young family who will then move in. But I'm going to be totally honest. I'm not buying that. Every baby boomer I know has moved into a bigger home. So I'm not buying that, but okay, fine. All right. But it closes an inherited property loophole that can lead to more rental properties. Like in other words, if people like Jeff Bridges could have an Airbnb that they rent out for $15,000 a month, right? Well, you could also just not get the, you could have, depending on the city you're in, it may not be an Airbnb that you're renting out every day, or you may not want the headache or whatever. But the idea is that it would close that loophole. Okay, now if you're against it, reassessing inherited property after a year is going to create just more inequities in the system. Maybe there are a lot of situations where it may not be your primary residence, but you still need it for one reason, or your family holds on to it. Maybe it's your family home. Maybe no one family member lives there all year, whatever. Maybe you own it, but then you have put your kid in that, and it's their primary residence now. I mean, there's a whole lot of situations where it could create a lot more inequities, actually. So they don't always lead to Airbnbs. Boomers don't always choose smaller homes. I've already said that. Now, 3 times, they're already protected by law with 1 transfer. That's a pretty big gift. Now we're going to gift them with 3 transfers. There are no limits on the transfer to houses based on price. That's what I understand. So that could lead to more inequities. So in fact, like let's suppose you pay $1,000 a month right now because the house you live in was built a long time ago and you bought it at bargain basement prices many, many years ago. So you pay $1,000. And now you want to sell your house and move into a house that costs $500,000. Well, your property tax bill would then be $5,000, not $1,000. This would allow you to take that $1,000, right, and transfer it over to that $500,000 house, right? And now, if it's more, I'm not gonna say this correctly because I'm trying to rush through it, but if there are certain gaps, like if it's worth a whole lot more, you can transfer part of it, and then the other part of it you would just pay on that increment, if that makes sense. So in other words, you can take the $1,000, you can buy a house that is worth more, okay, that's worth more, but you get to keep the $1,000 up to a certain amount and then only pay on the certain amount above whatever you were paying before. It's confusing, yes, and that's just a sign that it's going to be super confusing for our county tax assessors. Holy crap, I don't know how they're going to keep, and if you're going to a different county, we're going to have to create now a super kind of computing software system to keep track of how much everybody in the state is paying and how much you would have paid under another scheme. This is like, I don't know, that I haven't seen a lot about that, but I'm actually really concerned about that because we're going to need a really costly bureaucratic new system just to keep track of all that. Who's got an increment here and not there because they would have done it and they're inherited, blah, blah, blah. So I'm not buying a whole lot of that, but okay. But if you feel like this will create more like exchange of properties, more will open up. You can stop, rich people from inheriting a house. Now it's not just rich people. Everybody who has who's a homeowner will pass it along to someone. So, close those loopholes if you're happy about that. Then we can, you would vote yes on this. Okay, questions. I'm going to take a drink of water.